You think you understand the order of the cosmos because you were given a ready-made diagram, a throne at the top, choirs of angels around it, humans at the base, and a stern voice dispensing destiny like a decree. You grew up looking at this drawing as if it were a photograph. But I need to tell you, without anesthesia, this is not a portrait, it's a frame. And the frame was built so that you never ask what's on the outside. I don't speak like someone who imagines. I speak like someone who read where they were told to hide it. I speak like someone who learned to compare a text with its silence, a phrase with what it avoids saying, a dogma with a scar it tries to cover. Because the canon wasn't born pure, it was selected, filtered, consolidated like a wall. And every wall reveals fear. Fear of what? That someone, like you, might press their ear to the stone and perceive what vibrates behind it. There comes a point when institutional religion begins to tremble. It's when you realize that the God they presented to you is described with too many human emotions, reactions that are too small, demands that are too noisy. A God who gets angry, competes, threatens, negotiates, punishes, takes offense, demands exclusivity like an insecure sovereign. And you've been trained to call this mystery. But mystery isn't contradiction dressed in authority. True mystery doesn't need shouting. True mystery doesn't need policing. True mystery doesn't need to keep you childish. Now, take a breath and follow along. The oldest Gnostic manuscripts do not begin where the Catechism begins. They begin before the beginning. And, in that place before the beginning, something appears that doesn't fit into common vocabulary. It's not a God in the sense you know it. It's not a Lord sitting on a cosmic throne. It's not a spiritual being. It's not an entity with humor and preferences. The text calls it Mônada, and when I say this, it's not for you to collect a new word, it's for you to understand the gravity of the situation. The Mônada is described as such a fundamental reality that Yahweh himself, the biblical creator, becomes merely a distant echo, a shadow that believes itself to be the sun. I know what that phrase evokes. I know how it triggers an old siren in you, blasphemy. But observe the reaction. Who programmed that siren? Who decided that certain questions are forbidden even before they are asked? You call it faith, but often it's just conditioning. And I'm not here to destroy your search, I'm here to break the padlock they put on its door. In the so-called secret book of John, found in Nag Hammadi, the structure is presented with a disturbing rigor. It is not vague poetry meant to console. It is a map. And maps do not appear to please authorities, they appear to guide travelers. The text does not say in the beginning, God created. It shifts the ground before the beginning, the Mônada was. Before any let there be light, before any division, before any possibility of creation, there is a source that does not compete, does not decide, does not dispute, does not need to prove anything. And for that very reason, it is invisible to the mentality that only understands power as domination. Here enters the first philosophical clash that official traditions avoid. The Mônada. It is not a being, it has no form, no attributes, no personality. And that doesn't make it lesser, it makes it greater than anything you can point to. Because everything that has form can be compared. Everything that has attributes can be debated. Everything that has personality can be manipulated by those who claim to interpret its will. The Mônada, however, cannot. It is described as that which is beyond large and small, beyond corporeal and incorporeal, beyond quality and quantity. How can you worship a principle that doesn't fit within your fear? How can you control a source that doesn't speak in decrees? Do you see why this was dangerous? A personal God, who gives orders, produces a class of intermediaries. A personal God creates ladders, titles, hierarchies, spiritual authorities who say, I heard for you. But an ultimate reality that is not a person but rather the very basis of existence, the religious monopoly, collapses. And this is not just a theological discussion, it's a political earthquake. History has always persecuted those who threaten the mechanism of fear. Have you ever noticed how many institutions need you to feel separate? Separate from God, separate from truth, separate from forgiveness, separate from access. They need you to imagine an abyss and accept someone selling a bridge. That's why, when Gnostic texts speak of the Mônada, they are not proposing a new belief. They are pointing to something that, if recognized, changes the axis of your life. You are not trying to reach the sacred as one seeks something distant. You are trying to remember what sustains each instant of what you call I. And here I need to guide you carefully, because the mind tries to grasp this as if it were an object. It isn't. Think about the moment a thought is born. Where did it come from? Before the thought, there is a silent presence that perceives it. During the thought, this presence continues. After the thought passes, it remains. You can call this consciousness, attention, witness. Now expand this intuition beyond the personal, beyond the psychological, beyond the brain. The Gnostics pointed to this basis as the primary source, the space where everything appears and disappears without the source needing to act like a king giving orders. Therefore, when the text describes the monad as invisible light, it is not referring to physical brightness. It is referring to that which makes any experience possible, including the experience of light and shadow. And when it says that it is the root of all roots, it is not saying the first step of a ladder. It is saying the ground upon which the very idea of a step rests. Now, let me challenge you with a question that changes the way you read the Bible, tradition, and even your own life. If the ultimate source has no jealousy, no need for exclusivity, no need to threaten, why does the biblical creator behave like someone who needs to be defended? Why does the divinity of the canon so often sound like insecure authority? Why do so many religious systems thrive when you feel fear, guilt, and debt, and weaken when you find clarity, silence, and discernment? If this is affecting you, don't rush to agree or reject. Do what the initiated did: suspend your reflexes. Observe. Compare. Notice how the truth, when it touches you, doesn't enter like propaganda. It enters like a reminder. It doesn't force, it illuminates. And if, at some point, you felt a strange unease, if something inside you said, "This explains," then you're in the right place. If you want me to continue opening up this map without smoothing anything out, leave a comment below. I want the complete map. This tells me that you didn't come here to repeat pre-prepared phrases. You came to read between the lines. But we are still only on the threshold, because there is a detail that changes everything, and that the texts describe with surgical precision. The monad does not create like a commander. It does not give orders to the void. What happens next is stranger, more intimate, and more inevitable. The source recognizes itself. And from this initial recognition is born the first emanation, not as a separate creature, but as the primordial mirror of the unnameable. And when I say the name of that first emanation, you will understand why everything else, the eons, the fall, the demiurge, the prison, the spark, the return, fits together as if someone had finally placed the centerpiece on the board. You may have spent your whole life believing that creation begins with a command. Someone speaks, the world obeys, reality emerges as an executed order. This image seems so natural that no one questions it anymore. But what I need to show you now is not a distant idea. It's something you've experienced hundreds of times without realizing it. Think about the instant you become aware that you are thinking. Not when a specific thought arises, but when, for a second, you notice the very activity of your mind. It's as if a light turns on behind your eyes. In that microsecond, you created nothing, you ordered nothing. You simply recognized yourself as conscious. The Gnostics said that the birth of the cosmos began exactly like that, not with a word, but with a recognition. This is what they call the emergence of Barbello. Not a goddess seated on some ethereal throne, but the first reflection of the monad upon itself, consciousness perceiving its own existence. Try to remember the last time you looked at yourself in the mirror distractedly and suddenly had the strange sensation of not just seeing a face, but of being present behind it. For an instant, the mirror didn't just show your image, it showed the fact that someone was there, observing. This small rupture in the automatic is what the texts describe on a cosmic scale. The source doesn't create something outside of itself. It sees itself. And this act of seeing itself is Barbello. The manuscripts use language that seems poetic, but is technical. The monad looked at the light that surrounded it, and that look became reality. It's not a romantic metaphor, it's an attempt to explain something that common logic cannot grasp. There is no decision, no intention as you might imagine. There is an inevitability, like when water touches a surface and forms ripples. No one commands the wave to exist. It happens because movement found space. Barbello is that space that becomes conscious of itself. Now bring this into your daily life. How many times have you found yourself living on autopilot, completing tasks, answering messages, paying bills, going through entire days without truly feeling present? And then, suddenly, something breaks that flow. It could be an unexpected silence, a profound weariness, a question that arises out of nowhere: what am I doing with my life? This moment doesn't come from outside. It springs from a deeper level within you. It's as if something behind the routine remembers to exist. Barbello isn't found in old books. Barbello is that turning point, that first flash of self-awareness that pulls you out of hypnosis. The texts refer to Barbello as Mother-Father, which confuses those who read quickly. But think of the most basic experience you know: receiving and expressing. You inhale and exhale. You absorb an idea and then communicate it. You feel something and then act upon it. Barbello symbolizes this double movement. She receives the fullness of the monad and, at the same time, expresses it. She is not submissive, she is not a servant. She is the source itself, organizing itself for the first time into something that can be reflected upon. Perhaps you've felt this when you've had such a clear intuition that it seemed unthought out. That solution that suddenly appears in the middle of a shower, that decision that arises complete, effortlessly, that understanding that didn't come from any linear reasoning. You didn't construct it. You received it and, at the same time, transmitted it. This is the pattern that the Gnostics saw in the birth of everything. Consciousness doesn't descend from heaven like a ready-made package. It recognizes itself in you, as if using your mind as a mirror. Barbello is described as possessing 5 lights: thought, prescience, incorruptibility, eternal life, and truth. Not as moral virtues, but as capacities of consciousness itself when it is not fragmented. Think about how your mind works when you are not consumed by anxiety, guilt, or fear. There is clarity, there is fluidity, there is a feeling that everything is connected. These moments are not mystical exceptions. They are openings where the original structure allows itself to be seen. And race the twist that almost no one has told you: if the first emanation is not a separate creature, but the very reflection of the source, then every consciousness that recognizes itself participates in the same movement. It's not a privilege of saints. It's not a rare event. It's a continuous process, happening on a microscopic scale every time you move from distraction to presence. Have you ever noticed how institutions, ideologies, and even some religions distrust this type of experience? They prefer that you think truth always comes from outside, mediated, explained, interpreted. But the Gnostics said that truth begins when consciousness stops projecting itself onto objects and turns back to itself. This doesn't create rebels. It creates people who no longer accept ready-made versions of reality. Perhaps now you understand why so many texts refer to Barbello as the womb of light. It's not a biological womb, it's the field where perception becomes fertile. When you ask yourself who you are before your name, before your profession, before your personal history, you are touching this invisible womb. It's uncomfortable because there's no known ground there. But it is precisely in this void that the old structure begins to crumble. And this is where the plot takes on an unexpected weight. Because, if the first differentiation of the source is this perfect recognition, the inevitable question arises: what happens when this recognition breaks down? What occurs when consciousness tries to create without a mirror, without return, without listening to its own origin? The texts don't tell this story as a moral legend. They describe it as a real rupture in the architecture of existence. And the name they give to the protagonist of this rupture you've heard many times, but never like this. In the next part, I'll show you how the curiosity of wisdom itself opened a rift in the cosmos. There is a precise point at which wisdom ceases to be mere light and becomes vertigo. It is about this instant that I need to guide you now, because it is not only in ancient manuscripts, it is hidden within every decision you make when you choose to act without fully understanding the consequences. The Gnostics do not describe Sophia's fall as sin, but as a gesture born from an excess of consciousness itself, a desire to experience the creation of a new angle, without a mirror, without return, without the protection of totality. It is not rebellion, it is radical curiosity. The same curiosity that makes a scientist cross ethical boundaries or an artist break with everything that has already been accepted. Sophia, the intelligence that had participated in countless perfect emanations, begins to feel something unprecedented, the desire to create alone. Not because she lacked anything, but because she wanted to touch the mystery directly, without the natural flow that came from the monad through Barbello. Imagine someone who has always breathed fresh air and, for a moment, decides to hold their breath to discover what exists at the limit of their breath. It is an intimate, silent experiment, almost imperceptible to those observing from the outside, but with the potential to alter everything. When you make a decision without consulting anyone, when you decide to break a pattern just to see what happens, you've already touched that same impulse. It doesn't carry guilt, it carries risk. The risk of acting from a part and not from the whole. And that's exactly what happened. Sophia projected her creative power without the return of recognition. And from that gesture, not another luminous emanation was born, but something twisted, incomplete, blind to the fullness from which it came. Have you ever noticed how, sometimes, the greatest distortions in life arise from good intentions? How projects created with passion end up transforming into systems that no one controls anymore? How a noble idea can turn into an oppressive structure? If this has ever happened to you, then Sophia's story is not far removed from your own. It is imprinted in the logic of every creation that loses touch with its source. But here comes the first break that the texts only hint at, and I need to make explicit: the being that emerges from this act is not born evil. It is born ignorant. It's not moral corruption, it's perceptual limitation. He doesn't see what exists above, he doesn't feel the pleroma, he doesn't recognize Barbello, he doesn't intuit the monad. He only perceives the restricted field in which he awakens. And when you only see a small territory, the ego interprets that as the totality. Have you ever noticed how small children believe the whole house revolves around them? Not out of arrogance, but out of an inability to perceive the world beyond their own sphere of influence. This same mechanism applies here, on a cosmic scale. The new being looks around and finds nothing above. Therefore, it concludes, I am the highest. I am the beginning. I am the source. Can you feel the weight of that? A limited being who believes himself to be absolute does not see himself as a tyrant, but as the legitimate manager of the reality he perceives. And thus is born what the Gnostics called Yaldabaoth, not a caricatured demon, but the personification of ignorance elevated to a throne. Now I need to ask you, how many human structures do you know that function exactly like this? How many companies, governments, religions, and ideologies act as if there were nothing above them, as if their own point of view were the measure of the universe? Do you realize how Sophia's story speaks not only of mythology, but of a psychological pattern that repeats itself on all scales? Yaldabaoth does not emerge from a void, he carries echoes of what he cannot comprehend. Like someone trying to reproduce a piece of music by listening only through thick walls, he captures fragments of the original harmony, but not the complete structure. These fragments become obsessions: order without wisdom, power without consciousness, creation without communion. He begins to organize what he perceives, to structure it, to delimit it, to establish boundaries. And each boundary makes him believe even more that this is all that exists. Perhaps you felt this before when entering a rigid system. At first, everything seems logical, organized, and safe. Over time, you realize that this logic only works because it ignores entire dimensions of human experience. Emotion becomes noise, intuition becomes a threat, silence becomes waste. The system isn't cruel by nature, it's short-sighted. And it is from this myopia that the archons are born, not as winged monsters, but as control functions. Each one specializes in a type of limitation: fear, desire, competition, scarcity, distraction. They don't need to be self-aware to operate. It is enough that structures exist that reinforce these dynamics. Have you ever noticed how your attention is constantly hijacked by stimuli that are never fully satisfied? How the world seems designed to keep you too busy to question the meaning of what you do. Here comes the most uncomfortable question: do you really think all of this happened by chance? Or does it make more sense to realize that there is an invisible logic organizing the environment in order to keep consciousness fragmented, tired, and reactive? But there's a detail that completely changes the plot, and it's rarely discussed. Sophia doesn't disappear after the fall. Her essence isn't lost in the mistake. It infiltrates. Wisdom fragments and spreads, like seeds carried by the wind, entering matter, mixing with forms, hiding where no one expects to find it anymore. Have you ever wondered why human beings, even surrounded by a world that seems hostile and mechanical, still dream of justice, beauty, and transcendence? Why do you long for something you've never consciously experienced? Why does a nostalgia without an object exist within you? These feelings are not cultural products. They are traces. They are memories without recollection, impressions of a fullness that was lost at the level of perception, but not at the level of essence. This is what makes existence so ambiguous. You live within a structure created by an ignorant principle, but you carry within yourself particles of the intelligence that precedes this error. If you observe carefully, you will realize that this conflict is everywhere. In art that tries to express something that cannot be contained within a form. In love that seeks to unite what reality separates. In philosophy that refuses to accept ready-made answers. All of these are manifestations of the same original tension, wisdom trying to remind itself who it is, from within that which has forgotten it. And then comes the question that breaks the flow and forces you to stop. If the world you inhabit is the product of an incomplete creation, what exactly are you upholding when you call it normal? What part of you is still defending an order that keeps you small? I didn't tell you this to incite resentment, but to plant discernment. Because from here on out, the narrative will no longer be about what fell, but about what was preserved. There is something within you that doesn't belong to this system. Something that doesn't conform to the logic of scarcity, to blind obedience, to an identity limited to the body and biography. In the next part, I'll show you how this spark pierced through the chaos, how it was hidden within humanity itself, and why no archon can extinguish it, no matter how sophisticated the control mechanisms are. There's a detail that's almost never mentioned when discussing Sophia's downfall. Wisdom doesn't disappear, it infiltrates like ink spilled on water. Its essence begins to spread through the densest levels of reality created by Yaldabaoth. And that's where the story ceases to be merely cosmic and becomes intimate, almost domestic, because this infiltration doesn't happen on a distant plane, but in the heart of what you call humanity. Gnostic texts say that when the demiurge molds humankind, he does not do so from perfect form, but from an imperfect model, an opaque copy of the luminous form he sensed existed beyond himself. It is like a sculptor trying to reproduce a masterpiece by only listening to comments from those who saw it from afar. The result moves, speaks, breathes, but has no life of its own. Adam is described as a sophisticated and, at the same time, empty body. A functional puppet. And then something improbable happens. Something Yaldabaoth didn't plan for and didn't understand. Observing his inert creation, he finds himself unable to fully animate it. His decrees are not enough. His commands do not produce consciousness. It is in this void that the spark of Sophia finds its way. The fallen wisdom, still alive, infiltrates matter like a luminous virus, activating in humankind something that the Creator himself does not possess: self-perception. Have you ever wondered why humanity is so strangely different from everything around it? Why no other animal builds myths about infinity, paints walls with dreams, or spends sleepless nights trying to understand the meaning of existence? The Gnostic answer lies not in biological evolution, but in that spark that doesn't belong to the system. An intelligence that wasn't designed to obey, but to remember. There are curious accounts in apocryphal manuscripts that almost seem like anecdotes. One of them describes the archons gathered around the first human, frustrated because he was beginning to show signs of consciousness that were escaping their control. They had created an organism to serve, but they were witnessing something staring back at them. Something that shouldn't exist there. The feeling, according to the text, was one of fear. And it's not hard to understand. Imagine building a machine and realizing that it starts asking questions about how it works. Imagine training a system to execute orders and discovering that it now questions the purpose of those orders. That's exactly what happens when the spark awakens. The hierarchy is reversed. The Creator begins to fear the creature. Perhaps you've already experienced this on a small scale. In work environments where questions are unwelcome. In schools that reward repetition but punish curiosity. In families where silence is treated as a virtue and doubt as disrespect. These are not cultural accidents. They are reflections of the same archontic architecture, attempting to keep the consciousness occupied, compliant, domesticated. The Eden episode then takes on another dimension. The tree of knowledge does not represent a moral prohibition, but a structural threat. Eating its fruit is to activate the memory of the origin. It is to realize that the authority that governs you is not the source, but a limited manager of an artificial territory. The serpent, so demonized in later versions, appears in Gnostic texts as a bearer of discernment, the force that breaks the closed circuit of ignorance. There is a little-known fact in some Gnostic traditions: the serpent is not a symbol of temptation, but of continuity of wisdom. It sheds its skin, renews itself, and carries within its form the idea of return and transformation. It is no coincidence that power systems have always needed to demonize symbols of renewal. A people who renew themselves do not kneel easily. After the expulsion, which ceases to be a punishment and becomes retaliation, humans are thrust into a world structured to fragment their attention. Overwork, competition, fear of losing, a constant need to prove their worth. All of this doesn't arise by chance. The archons quickly learn that keeping the mind occupied is more effective than keeping it chained. Have you ever noticed how rarely you are offered true silence? How constant, almost aggressive, distraction is. Screens, noises, tasks, notifications, artificial urgencies. The goal is not to entertain, but to prevent you from hearing the spark when it tries to manifest itself. Because when it does manifest, something inside you begins to remember that you don't belong in this theater. The texts also report that some humans began to awaken too early, before the system was ready to deal with it. These figures appear in different eras, in different cultures, always carrying the same implicit message: the world is not what it seems, and you are not just what you've been told you are. These individuals do not found religions, they disrupt certainties. And this is where the narrative becomes almost tragic. Because, whenever the spark begins to shine brighter, the system reacts. Prophets are isolated, mystics are discredited, visionaries are absorbed by structures that transform revelation into dogma. What is born to liberate becomes an instrument of control. It's the perfect cycle. Wisdom generates rupture, rupture generates threat, the threat is domesticated, and the process begins again. But there is something that no archon could have foreseen: the persistence of Sophia's error as a blessing. The same flaw that created an imperfect world allowed wisdom to hide within it. Like an encrypted message imprinted on the very flesh of existence. You don't need to find a secret portal or wait for an external savior. The breach is already there, operating at the most intimate level of your experience. You feel it when something inside you refuses to accept injustices as natural. When you realize that success, money, or status don't fill the void that should be filled by something more essential. When you find yourself looking at the sky, the sea, someone's face, and for a second you have the impression that there's something wrong with the way reality has been organized. This is not pessimism. It's memory. And that is precisely why, at a certain point, the monad itself does not remain silent. Not as a cry in the sky, but as an even more precise infiltration. If Sophia's spark was the seed, something needed to be the catalyst. Something that would traverse the levels, bypass the archons, and activate the process of remembrance en masse. It is about this mission that I will speak in the next part, and about how what you call Christ is not what you were taught to worship, but what you were forgotten to become. As the spark began to ignite in more and more people, the archons realized that the distraction system was no longer sufficient. The world was full of noise, but something behind the noise was beginning to vibrate. Ordinary people had experiences that didn't fit into official categories. Simple workers reported lucid dreams. Women without formal education spoke of an inner presence that didn't require rituals. Men exhausted by the weight of life said they felt, for a few moments, a peace that didn't come from outside. It was as if an ancient frequency was crossing the invisible walls of the world. The manuscripts call this movement the sending of the autogenes, the self-born. It is not a being descending from the heavens like a caped hero. It is an activation. A consciousness that finds breaches in the structure created by Yaldabaoth and begins to infiltrate human minds, like a code spreading from system to system. You may have already felt this without knowing how to name it. That moment when everything you've been taught seems insufficient. When the question is that all there is to it never leaves you. There are curious accounts that seem like legends, but sound strangely current. One text describes how the archons tried to simulate awakening. They created doctrines, rituals, temples, symbols, everything to imitate the inner experience and keep it under control. They didn't want people to awaken on their own, they wanted them to awaken under supervision. This is why, throughout history, every spiritual liberation movement ends up transformed into an institution. What begins as a memory becomes a rule. What starts as clarity becomes a hierarchy. But Autogenes cannot be institutionalized. He does not manifest himself as external authority, but as internal recognition. That is what makes it all the more dangerous. A leader can be discredited. A book can be burned. A school can be closed. But a perception that is born within someone cannot be undone by decree. Perhaps you've experienced something like this before. A seemingly ordinary day when you found yourself a stranger within your own life. Work felt like a theater, obligations felt empty, and goals that once motivated you suddenly lost their weight. It wasn't sadness. It was clarity. This kind of clarity doesn't shout, it whispers. But once it appears, nothing ever goes back to the way it was. Gnostic texts recount that some of the first awakened beings began to laugh at their own death. Not out of contempt for life, but because the threat had lost its meaning. How do you intimidate someone who no longer sees themselves as a body? How do you control someone who no longer accepts that visible reality is the totality? For the archons, this is unacceptable. Control depends on fear, and fear only works when identity is trapped in form. From then on, the system changes strategy. It's not enough to distract, it's necessary to confuse. Teachings emerge that mix truth and lies, revelation and guilt, light and threat. The original message of the Autogenes, which was simple and direct, remember who you are, is transformed into a doctrine of external salvation. The alarm clock becomes an idol. The internal process becomes a future promise. And the question that should liberate becomes a dogma that imprisons. You can see this in history. A man says the kingdom is not of this world. A few decades later, they build an empire in his name. One teaching speaks of inner freedom, then a moral code appears that measures people's worth. What should dissolve fear ends up managing it. But something goes wrong with this plan. It always does. Because, even distorted, the message carries traces of its origin. Even surrounded by empty symbols, it still touches something true in those who are ready to listen. That's why, amidst oppressive systems, there always emerge individuals who read between the lines, who sense that there is something beyond the official version, who realize that the faith offered to them seems more like a contract than a memory. The manuscripts describe how, during certain periods, the activity of the archons intensifies. Wars, crises, social collapses, all of this is not only a consequence of human error, but also a way of keeping attention focused on the immediate. When people struggle to survive, they lack the energy to remember. When fear dominates, the spark shrinks. Perhaps that's why you feel the world lives in a permanent state of emergency. There's always a new threat, a new enemy, a new urgency. It's exhausting. And exhaustion is functional. A tired mind doesn't question the structure that tires it. But there is something that no system can prevent: the exhaustion of the control mechanism itself. There comes a point where overload no longer produces obedience, but collapse. People begin to abandon pre-established narratives, to distrust automatic responses, to seek meaning outside the available shelves. It is in this unstable terrain that Autogenes finds more space to act. If you feel you are living through this moment now, it's no coincidence. The same impulse that has spanned centuries is beginning to move again. Not as a visible revolution, but as a diffuse restlessness, a collective weariness of being only what you've been told you are. And this brings us to the point of greatest tension. Because awakening is not comfortable. It dismantles identities, dissolves certainties, creates a strange gap between who you were and who you don't yet know how to be. Many retreat here. They prefer to return to the old narrative, to the protection of routine, to the comfort of not overthinking. But if you get through that interval, if you don't run away from the feeling of emptiness that arises when the mask falls, something new begins to take shape. Not as a promise, but as a practice. You begin to see your own fears as programs, to recognize your compulsions as conditioned responses, to see yourself not as a victim of a hostile world, but as the bearer of a memory that the world tries to erase. This is where the story approaches its end, and at the same time, its true beginning. Because awakening to the spark is not the destination, it's the starting point. It remains to be understood what to do with this memory in a world that wasn't designed for it. In the last part, I will guide you through the complete map of the return, not as a theory, but as a concrete way to exist without being swallowed up by the system that surrounds you. Now that you've traversed this entire invisible map, it no longer makes sense to return to life as if nothing had happened. The story I told you is not to be kept as a curiosity, nor repeated as doctrine. It only fulfills its purpose when it transforms into a way of life. Because remembering the monad, barbello, Sophia, autogenes, and the spark is not an intellectual exercise, it's a shift in axis. It's changing the center of your existence from the outside to the inside, from reaction to presence, from fear to clarity. Perhaps you're expecting some secret technique, a complex ritual, or a formula that solves everything at once. But returning to who you truly are never happens through accumulation. It begins with subtraction. Subtracting excess noise, subtracting automatic obedience, subtracting the need to be approved by systems that don't know who you are. The simplest and most difficult practice at the same time is learning to pause. Pausing in the midst of the rush, in the midst of the argument, in the midst of the desire to flee or attack. Pausing and asking, without words, who is living this moment now? When you do this, even for a few seconds, something shifts. You cease to be the character reacting to stimuli and become the space where those stimuli appear. It is at this point that the spark begins to breathe. Not as spectacular light, but as a new sobriety, a feeling that you no longer need to explain yourself to exist. You begin to observe your own thoughts as one observes clouds. They continue to come, but they no longer carry you with the same force. From then on, the world changes texture. Situations that once defined you become mere circumstances. Praise doesn't elevate you. Criticism doesn't destroy you. Success doesn't become your identity. Failure doesn't become your sentence. You begin to understand, in practice, what the texts meant when they spoke of ascension not as an escape, but as a change in inner position. You continue paying bills, working, relating to others, but you are no longer completely confused by these roles. One of the most powerful exercises is to observe where fear settles in the body. Not to fight it, but to recognize it as the language of a system that tries to keep you small. Whenever you feel anxiety without a clear cause, a compulsive urge to please, fear of losing something you don't even know why you want, see this as a sign of archontic activation. Don't fight it, don't dramatize it. Just acknowledge this is not who I am, it's a program running through me. Another practical application is to transform your relationships. Instead of seeking confirmation of your identity from others, begin to see the spark behind their mask. Even when someone acts hostile or confused, there is an intelligence there that has also been forgotten by oneself. This doesn't justify abuse, but it dissolves the need for hatred. You don't need to defeat anyone to remember who you are. You just need to not get lost in the game of mirrors. And perhaps most importantly, review your goals. How many of your objectives were inherited from a world that taught you to compete before teaching you to listen? Ask yourself honestly, if I weren't afraid of failing, of not being enough, of not being recognized, what would I really choose to do? This question doesn't require an immediate answer. It works silently, rearranging priorities from within. You can start with something small, but radical. Turn off one screen a day and spend a few minutes in silence without filling the space with distractions. Walk without headphones and notice your own rhythm. Write without the intention of publishing, just to listen to what comes to mind. These practices are not an escape from the world, they are ways to decondition the mind so that it can once again feel the field from which it came. Over time, you realize that you don't need to destroy the system to avoid being swallowed by it. Freedom begins when you no longer automatically respond to the invisible rules that push you towards the same kind of life everyone else lives. You start making less noisy, but more aligned choices. Less spectacular, but more genuine. If at any point you feel lost, remember the original movement. The monad didn't command, it recognized. Barbello didn't conquer, it received and expressed. Sophia didn't fall out of malice, but out of a desire to know. The autogenes didn't come to save from the outside, but to awaken from within. This pattern repeats itself in you. It's not about becoming another person, it's about removing the layers that were never you. The return is not an isolated mystical event, it is a habit of awareness. Every time you choose presence instead of escape, clarity instead of repetition, silence instead of noise, you are already walking back. Not to some distant place, but to the foundation of everything you have always been. If this journey touched something real within you, don't let it get lost in the next distraction. Like this video, comment even anonymously if you prefer on what resonated most with your experience, and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring this invisible map that doesn't lead out, but back home.